The conlang flag, a symbol of language construction created by subscribers to the conlang mailing list, which represents the Tower of Babel against a rising sun. A planned or constructed language, sometimes called a conlang, is a language whose phonology, grammar, and vocabulary have been consciously devised for human or human-like communication, instead of having developed naturally. It is also referred to as an artificial or invented language. There are many possible reasons to create a constructed language. To ease human communication, see International Auxiliary Language and Code. To give fiction or an associated constructed world an added layer of realism. For linguistic experimentation, for artistic creation, and for language games. The expression planned language is sometimes used to mean international auxiliary languages and other languages designed for actual use in human communication. Some prefer it to the term artificial, as that term may have pejorative connotations in some languages. Outside the Esperanto community, the term language planning means the prescriptions given to a natural language to standardize it. In this regard, even natural languages may be artificial in some respects. Prescriptive grammars, which date to ancient times for classical languages such as Latin and Sanskrit, are rule-based codifications of natural languages, such codifications being a middle ground between naive natural selection and development of language, and its explicit construction. The term glossopia is also used to mean language construction, particularly construction of artistic languages. An ad hoc July 2011 LinkedIn search by Gary Dale Searley, blogging as Hyperglot, better source needed, found the 3 most widely spoken constructed languages in his extended network of colleagues are Esperanto, Interlingua, and Klingon. As a quantitative example of the use of conlangs within a country, the Hungarian census of 2001 found 4,570 speakers of Esperanto, 10 for Romanid, 4 for Esperantido, 2 each for Interlingua and Edo, and 1 each for Idiom Neutral and Mundolingue. Planned, constructed, artificial. The terms planned, constructed, and artificial are used differently in some traditions. For example, few speakers of Interlingua consider their language artificial, since they assert that it has no invented content. Interlingua's vocabulary is taken from a small set of natural languages, and its grammar is based closely on these source languages, even including some degree of irregularity. Its proponents prefer to describe its vocabulary and grammar as standardized rather than artificial or constructed. Similarly, Latino sign flexion, LSF, is a simplification of Latin, from which the inflections have been removed. As with Interlingua, some prefer to describe its development as planning rather than constructing. Some speakers of Esperanto and Esperantidos also avoid the term artificial language, because they deny that there is anything unnatural about their use of their language in human communication. By contrast, some philosophers have argued that all human languages are conventional or artificial. François Rabelais, for instance, stated, "Essebus de dire que nous avons une langue naturelle, les langues sont par institution arbitraires et conventions des peuples." It's misuse to say that we have a natural language. Languages are by institution arbitrary and conventions of peoples. An artificial language can also refer to languages which emerge naturally out of experimental studies within the framework of artificial language evolution. Further, fictional and experimental languages can be naturalistic in that they are meant to sound natural, have realistic amounts of irregularity, and, if derived a posteriori from a real-world natural language, or real-world reconstructed proto-language, such as Vulgar Latin or Proto-Indo-European, or from a fictional proto-language, they try to imitate natural processes of phonological, lexical and grammatical change. In contrast with Interlingua, these languages are not usually intended for easy learning or communication, and most Artlangers would not consider Interlingua to be naturalistic in the sense in which this term is used in Artlang criticism. Thus, a naturalistic fictional language tends to be more difficult and complex. While Interlingua has simpler grammar, syntax, and orthography than its source languages, though more complex and irregular than Esperanto or its descendants, naturalistic fictional languages typically mimic behaviors of natural languages, like irregular verbs and nouns, and complicated phonological processes. Overview. In terms of purpose, most constructed languages can broadly be divided into engineered languages, Ngelang/Ndialazi/, further subdivided into logical languages, loglangs, philosophical languages, and experimental languages, devised for the purpose of experimentation in logic, philosophy, or linguistics. Auxiliary languages, auxlangs, devised for international communication, also IALs, for international auxiliary language. Artistic languages, artlangs, devised to create aesthetic pleasure or humorous effect, just for fun, usually secret languages, and mystical languages are classified as artlangs. The boundaries between these categories are by no means clear. A constructed language could easily fall into more than one of the above categories. A logical language created for aesthetic reasons would also be classifiable as an artistic language, which might be created by someone with philosophical motives intending for said conlang to be used as an auxiliary language. There are no rules, either inherent in the process of language construction or externally imposed, that would limit a constructed language to fitting only one of the above categories. A constructed language can have native speakers, if young children learn it from parents who speak it fluently. According to Ethnologue, there are 202,000 who speak Esperanto as a first language, most famously George Soros. A member of the Klingon Language Institute, Darman Spears, attempted to raise his son as a native, bilingual with English, Klingon speaker. As soon as a constructed language has a community of fluent speakers, especially if it has numerous native speakers, it begins to evolve and hence loses its constructed status. For example, modern Hebrew was modeled on Biblical Hebrew rather than engineered from scratch, and has undergone considerable changes since the State of Israel was founded in 1948, Hetzron 1996-93. However, linguist Gilad Zuckerman argues that modern Hebrew, which he terms Israeli, is a Semito-European hybrid, based not only on Hebrew, but also on Yiddish and other languages spoken by revivalists. Zuckerman therefore endorses the translation of the Hebrew Bible into what he calls Israeli. Esperanto as a living spoken language has evolved significantly from the prescriptive blueprint published in 1887, so that modern editions of the Fundamenta Crastama show, a 1903 collection of early texts in the language, require many footnotes on the syntactic and lexical differences between early and modern Esperanto. Proponents of constructed languages often have many reasons for using them. The famous but disputed Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is sometimes cited. This claims that the language one speaks influences the way one thinks. Thus, a better language should allow the speaker to think more clearly or intelligently, or to encompass more points of view. This was the intention of Suzette Haden-Elgin in creating Latin, a feminist language embodied in her feminist science fiction series Native Tongue. A constructed language could also be used to restrict thought, as in George Orwell's Newspeak, or to simplify thought, as in Toki Pona. In contrast, linguists such as Steven Pinker argue that ideas exist independently of language. Thus, children spontaneously reinvent slang, and even grammar with each generation. See the language instinct. If this is true, attempts to control the range of human thought through the reform of language would fail, as concepts like freedom will reappear in new words, if the old vanish. Proponents claim a particular language makes it easier to express and understand concepts in one area, and more difficult in others. An example can be taken from the way various computer languages make it easier to write certain kinds of programs, and harder to write others. Another reason cited for using a constructed language is the telescope rule. This claims that it takes less time to first learn a simple constructed language, and then a natural language, than to learn only a natural language. Thus, if someone wants to learn English, some suggest learning basic English first. Constructed languages, like Esperanto and Interlingua, are in fact often simpler due to the typical lack of irregular verbs and other grammatical quirks. Some studies have found that learning Esperanto helps in learning a non-constructed language later. See propedeutic value of Esperanto. The ISO 639-2 standard reserves the language code art to artificial languages. However, some constructed languages have their own ISO 639 language codes, e.g. EO and EPO for Esperanto, JBO for Lojban, IA and INA for Interlingua, TLH for Klingon, and IO and EDO for Edo. A priori and a posteriori languages. An a priori language is a language whose vocabulary is not based on an existing language. An a posteriori language is the opposite. An example of an a priori language could be Lojban. An example of an a posteriori language could be Esperanto or Interlingua. History. Ancient linguistic experiments. Grammatical speculation dates from classical antiquity, appearing for instance in Plato's Cratylus and Hermogenes' contention that words are not inherently linked to what they refer to, that people apply a piece of their own voice to the thing. Athanasius of Naucratis, in Book 3 of Deepness Sophisti, tells the story of two figures, Dionysius of Sicily and Alexarchus. Dionysius of Sicily created neologisms like Menandros virgin from mene waiting and andra husbandman, Crates pillar from mene, it remains in one place, and Crateat is strong, and ball ancient javelin from ballet high and ancient thrown against someone. Incidentally, the more common Greek words for those three are Parthenos, Stulos, and Akon. Alexarchus of Macedon, the brother of King Cassander of Macedon, was the founder of the city of Uranopolis. Athanasius recounts a story told by Heracleides of Lembos that Alexarchus introduced a peculiar vocabulary, referring to a rooster as a dawn crier, a barber as a mortal shaver, a drachma as work silver, and a herald as anaputes from puta loud-voiced. He once wrote something to the public authorities in Cassandria as, "For what this letter says, in my opinion not even the Pythian god could make sense of it." While the mechanisms of grammar suggested by classical philosophers were designed to explain existing languages, Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, they were not used to construct new grammars. Roughly contemporary to Plato, in his descriptive grammar of Sanskrit, Pliny constructed a set of rules for explaining language, so that the text of his grammar may be considered a mixture of natural and constructed language. Early constructed languages. Page 68 are of the Voynich manuscript. This 3-page foldout from the manuscript includes a chart that appears astronomical. The earliest non-natural languages were considered less constructed than supernatural, mystical, or divinely inspired. The Lingua Ignota, recorded in the 12th century by Saint Hildegard of Bingen, is an example, and apparently the first entirely artificial language. It is a form of private mystical cant. See also Language of Angels. An important example from Middle Eastern culture is Balibalan, invented in the 16th century. Kabbalistic grammatical speculation was directed at recovering the original language spoken by Adam and Eve in Paradise, lost in the confusion of tongues. The first Christian project for an ideal language is outlined in Dante Alighieri's De Vulgari Eloquentia, where he searches for the ideal Italian vernacular suited for literature. Ramon Lull's Ars Magna was a project of a perfect language with which the infidels could be convinced of the truth of the Christian faith. It was basically an application of combinatorics on a given set of concepts vague during the Renaissance. Lullian and Kabbalistic ideas were drawn upon in a magical context, resulting in cryptographic applications. The Voynich manuscript may be an example of this. Perfecting language. Renaissance interest in ancient Egypt, notably the discovery of the hieroglyphic of Horapollo, and first encounters with the Chinese script directed efforts towards a perfect written language. Johannes Trithemius, in Steganographia and Polygraphia, attempted to show how all languages can be reduced to one. In the 17th century, interest in magical languages was continued by the Rosicrucians and alchemists like John Dee and his Enochian. Jacob Boehm in 1623 spoke of a natural language Nadersprake of the senses. Musical languages from the Renaissance were tied up with mysticism, magic, and alchemy, sometimes also referred to as the language of the birds. The Salresal Project of 1817 reinvented the concept in a more pragmatic context. 17th and 18th century, advent of philosophical languages. The 17th century saw the rise of projects for philosophical or a priori languages, such as Francis Lodwick's A Common Writing, 1647, and the groundwork or foundation laid, or so intended, for the framing of a new perfect language, and a universal common writing, 1652. Sir Thomas Urquhart's Ex Kybaloron, 1651, and Logopondectasion, 1652. George Dalgarno's Seniorum, 1661. John Wilkins' S. 8 Words, a Real Character, and a Philosophical Language, 1668. These early taxonomic conlangs produced systems of hierarchical classification that were intended to result in both spoken and written expression. Leibniz had a similar purpose for his Lingua Generalis of 1678, aiming at a lexicon of characters upon which the user might perform calculations that would yield true propositions automatically, as a side effect developing binary calculus. These projects were not only occupied with reducing or modeling grammar, but also with the arrangement of all human knowledge into characters or hierarchies, an idea that with the Enlightenment would ultimately lead to the encyclopedia. Many of these 17th-18th centuries conlangs were pasigraphies, or purely written languages with no spoken form, or a spoken form that would vary greatly according to the native language of the reader. Leibniz and the encyclopedists realized that it is impossible to organize human knowledge unequivocally in a tree diagram, and consequently to construct an a priori language based on such a classification of concepts. Under the entry Charactere, Alembert critically reviewed the projects of philosophical languages of the preceding century. After the encyclopedia, projects for a priori languages moved more and more to the lunatic fringe. Individual authors, typically unaware of the history of the idea, continue to propose taxonomic philosophical languages until the early 20th century, e.g. but most recent engineered languages have had more modest goals. Some are limited to a specific field, like mathematical formalism or calculus, e.g. Lencos and programming languages. Others are designed for eliminating syntactical ambiguity, e.g. Loglan and Lojban, or maximizing conciseness, e.g. ITQL. 19th and 20th century, auxiliary languages. Already in the encyclopedia, attention began to focus on a posteriori auxiliary languages. Joachim Faget de Villeneuve in the article on Lang wrote a short proposition of a laconic, or regularized grammar of French. During the 19th century, a bewildering variety of such international auxiliary languages, IALs, were proposed, so that Louis Couturat and Leopold Low in Histoire de la Langue Universelle, 1903, reviewed 38 projects. The first of these that made any international impact was Volapük, proposed in 1879. By Johann Martin Schleyer. Within a decade, 283 Volapücus clubs were counted all over the globe. However, disagreements between Schleyer and some prominent users of the language led to schism, and by the mid-1890s it fell into obscurity, making way for Esperanto, proposed in 1887 by Ludwig Zamenhof and its descendants. Interlingua, the most recent Auxlang, to gain a significant number of speakers, emerged in 1951, when the International Auxiliary Language Association published its Interlingua English Dictionary and an accompanying grammar. The success of Esperanto did not stop others from trying to construct new auxiliary languages, such as Leslie Jones' Eurolingo, which mixes elements of English and Spanish, or Hiafu's Mondlingo, which introduces more English roots instead of Latin ones. Loglan, 1955, and its descendants constitute a pragmatic return to the aims of the a priori languages, tempered by the requirement of usability of an auxiliary language. Thus far, these modern a priori languages have garnered only small groups of speakers. Robot Interaction Language, 2010, is a spoken language that is optimized for communication between machines and humans. The major goals of ROILA are that it should be easily learnable by the human user, and optimized for efficient recognition by computer speech recognition algorithms. Artlangs. Artistic languages, constructed for literary enjoyment or aesthetic reasons without any claim of usefulness, begin to appear in early modern literature, in Pantagruel and in utopian contexts, but they only seem to gain notability as serious projects beginning in the 20th century. A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs was possibly the first fiction of that century to feature a constructed language. J.R.R. Tolkien was the first to develop a family of related fictional languages, and was the first academic to discuss artistic languages publicly, giving a lecture entitled A Secret Vice in 1931, at a congress. Orwell's Newspeak is considered a satire of an IAL rather than an artistic language proper. By the beginning of the first decade of the 21st century, it had become common for science fiction and fantasy works set in other worlds to feature constructed languages, or more commonly, an extremely limited but defined vocabulary which suggests the existence of a complete language, and constructed languages are a regular part of the genre, appearing in Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, Elvish, Stargate SG-1, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, Game of Thrones, Dothraki language and Valyrian languages, Avatar, Dune and the Myth series of computer adventure games. Modern conlang organizations. Various papers on constructed languages were published from the 1970s through the 1990s, such as Glossopia Quarterly, Taboo Jadoo, and the Journal of Planned Languages. The conlang mailing list was founded in 1991, and later split off an EUXLANG mailing list dedicated to international auxiliary languages. In the early to mid-1990s a few conlang-related zines were published as email-or websites, such as Fort Punoy and Model Languages. The conlang mailing list has developed a community of conlangers with its own customs, such as translation challenges and translation relays, and its own terminology. Sarah Higley reports from results of her surveys that the demographics of the conlang list are primarily men from North America and Western Europe, with a smaller number from Oceania, Asia, the Middle East, and South America, with an age range from 13 to over 60. The number of women participating has increased over time. More recently founded online communities include the Zompus Bulletin Board, ZBB, since 2001, and the Conlanger Bulletin Board. Discussion on these forums includes presentation of members' conlangs and feedback from other members. Discussion of natural languages, whether particular conlang features have natural language precedents, and how interesting features of natural languages can be repurposed for conlangs, posting of interesting short texts as translation challenges, and meta-discussion about the philosophy of conlanging, conlangers' purposes, and whether conlanging is an art or a hobby. Another 2001 survey by Patrick Jarrett showed an average age of 30.65, with the average time since starting to invent languages 11.83 years. A more recent thread on the ZBB showed that many conlangers spend a relatively small amount of time on any one conlang, moving from one project to another. About a third spend years on developing the same language. Collaborative constructed languages. The Talisan language, a cultural base for the micronation known as Talasa, was created by a single person in 1979. However, as interest in Talisan grew, guidance of the language became, in 1983, the province of a recommending body, the Comité per Utsil Delgaha, and other independent organizations of enthusiasts. Vilnian draws on Latin, Greek, and the Scandinavian languages. In its syntax and grammar it is reminiscent of Chinese. The core elements were created by a single person, and its vocabulary is now enlarged by suggestions from the Internet community. While most constructed languages begin, as did Talisan, having been created by a single person, a few are created by group collaborations. Examples of these are Interlingua, which was developed by the International Auxiliary Language Association, and Lojban, which was developed by a breakaway group of loglanists. Group collaboration has apparently become more common in recent years, as constructed language designers have started using Internet tools to coordinate design efforts. NGL/Doxer was an early Internet collaborative engineered language, whose designers used a mailing list to discuss and vote on grammatical and lexical design issues. More recently, the Demos-IAL project was developing an international auxiliary language with similar collaborative methods. The Voxegid and Novial 98 languages were both worked on by mailing lists, though neither was issued in final form. Several artistic languages have been developed on different constructed language wikis, usually involving discussion and voting on phonology, grammatical rules, and so forth. An interesting variation is the Corpus Approach, exemplified by Madjal, late 2004, and Kalusa, mid-2006, where contributors simply read the corpus of existing sentences and add their own sentences, perhaps reinforcing existing trends or adding new words and structures. The Kalusa engine adds the ability for visitors to rate sentences as acceptable or unacceptable. There is no explicit statement of grammatical rules or explicit definition of words. In this corpus approach, the meaning of words is inferred from their use in various sentences of the corpus, perhaps in different ways by different readers and contributors, and the grammatical rules can be inferred from the structures of the sentences that have been rated highest by the contributors and other visitors.